Good morning, everyone. It's Monica McDougall here, pastor of Attica First United Methodist Church, and it is a joy to be with you all this morning, Sunday, October 1st. My sermon this morning was inspired by a story from the book of Exodus, in which the ancient Israelites wandering in the desert receive manna and quail from God. Specifically, we will be reading from Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 15, and this comes from the Common English Translation, or the CEB. So I hope you will join me in preparing our hearts and minds for worship this morning as we hear these words from the book of Exodus. The whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them, "Oh, how we wish that the Lord had just put us to death while we were still in the land of Egypt. There we could sit by the pots cooking meat and eat our fill of bread. Instead, you've brought us out into this desert to starve this whole assembly." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to make bread rain down from the sky for you. The people will go out each day and gather just enough for that day. In this way, I will test them to see whether or not they follow my instructions. On the sixth day, when they measure out what they have collected, it will be twice as much as what they collected on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glorious presence, because your complaints against the Lord have been heard. Who are we? Why blame us?" Moses continued, "The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard your complaints, the complaints you made against him. Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole Israelite community, 'Come near to the Lord, because he's heard your complaints.'" As Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look toward the desert, and just then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses, "I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew all around. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, "This is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. Before I begin, I want to say that this is one of those sermons that would not have been possible without my husband, Mac. This was one of those weeks. It was very hectic. It really felt like I had so much to do and not enough time to do it. And it is in those moments that I'm very grateful that I have a spouse who is a pastor and can be a sounding board and a resource for me as I'm drafting my sermons. So just know that a lot of the scholarship that I used to support this sermon came from Mac. Mac, thank you very much for your help this week. But as you might remember, this past July, I was able to take a vacation to Colorado with my parents and with my husband, Mac. This was Mac's first time on a vacation with my family. It was our first family vacation, my parents and I, since my brother passed. So it was quite an interesting trip, but we went someplace that we know and love really well. We went to Estes Park, which is just outside of Rocky Mountain National Park, which meant that we were able to take several trips into the national park. And I've already, in a separate sermon, shared with you my experience in the Alpine Tundra, where we visited the Alpine Visitor Center way above the tree line. But today I want to share with you about a different journey we took on this trip. One day, Mac and I decided to hike up to Alberta Falls. There are multiple ways to get to the falls, but we decided to hike there from Bear Lake, which was the longest way to get there, but it was less steep. The trip was about 1.6 mile hike, a round trip, so it's not a crazy hike by any means. However, it's above 9,000 feet above sea level, and Mac has a bit of exercise-induced asthma, so when it came to making this hike and other hikes, we just knew we needed to take it easy. slow and steady wins the race, right? That was sort of our mentality. So as we set out for Alberta Falls, we took frequent breaks for Mac. But soon we ended up realizing that the little breaks we were taking were really spectacular. They allowed us opportunities to step off of the trail, to discover things that were hidden just outside of view. If you're focused on the trail, we found little streams and interesting rock formations, secret views tucked behind trees and boulders. We even were able to see some interesting wildlife. We got to see a snowshoe hare, which we learned from a park ranger was a pretty rare sighting for that time of year. So we were very excited about that. And we just found that we were really looking forward to each of our little breaks, not only for the opportunity to rest, right? To catch our breath, to let our tired legs have a bit of a breather, but it was really because we knew we were going to discover something new each time we stopped. But interestingly, almost every time we stopped for one of those breaks, whether we were sitting or standing, another hiker passing us would say something to try to encourage us. They would say to us things like, "You're almost there, you can do it just a little bit further, it's worth the effort, we promise," right? And as we heard these frequent comments from our fellow hikers, Mac and I started to make some observations. The first observation we made is that as we neared our destination, we started to see many of the same people who had passed us on the way up, turning and coming back down. And this was interesting because for them to have passed us going up and now to be passing us going back down, then that meant that they had only stayed at the falls a minute or two before they turned around and started making their way back. It was as if they completed their objective, they reached the top of the falls, they crossed it off their list, and they immediately moved on to what was next on their list. Our second observation was that as we made our frequent stops, more than half of them were just because one of us saw something we wanted to explore further. Yet people were encouraging us as if we were having a really hard time hiking. It was as if they couldn't understand why you would stop on this trail for any reason other than needing a break. And the final observation we made was that whenever we did see other groups of hikers stopping, there seemed to be a sense of urgency to get back up and keep going, especially from other people in the group. It was almost as if they were frustrated that they had to stop at all. And when they did stop, they would face forward on the trail. They weren't looking around or taking in the scene all around them. They were looking at the rest of the hike ahead of them. And even as people were hiking, most of them were looking down at their feet or straight ahead, not looking out at this beautiful Colorado scene that was all around us. It was if people were so fixated on the destination that they were failing to appreciate the journey to get there. When I selected our scripture passage this morning from Exodus, I couldn't help but connect it to this hike that Mac and I took to Alberta Falls. In this story, the ancient Israelites are on a journey of their own. They have been delivered out of captivity in Egypt by Moses, free from bondage under Pharaoh. All of their problems are finally solved, right? Well, unfortunately, not so fast. Moses has delivered them out of Egypt, did what he said he would do, but now they're wandering the desert. The promised land that Moses told them they would find is nowhere in sight. It's been about a month since they've left Egypt, and they are getting to the point where they are very concerned. I bet at the start of their journey in the wilderness, they were just happy to be free from captivity and on their way to that promised land, that land flowing with milk and honey, right? They had survived a lot in their lives, brutal captivity in Egypt, those plagues, right? They survived all of that. They survived crossing the Red Sea, they being pursued by the Egyptians. Moses, with the help of God acting through Moses, was able to bury the Egyptian pursuers behind them. And that is very intense, right? So I bet they're living on this adrenaline, right? But it doesn't take long for that adrenaline to calm and their perspective to start to shift. because they realized that walking the desert every day for miles and miles for weeks on end is not exactly the journey that they thought they were going to be taking. And so in their hunger and their frustration and their exhaustion, they began to view their past in Egypt through rose-colored glasses, misremembering that time in captivity. In the wilderness, they are hungry and tired and scared, and they take it out on Moses and Aaron, the leaders of this group. They say to Moses and Aaron that it would have been better if they had been left in Egypt to die, because at least in Egypt they knew where their next meal was coming from, right? But Moses and Aaron brought them to the desert, brought them there to starve to death. In other words, it's all Moses and Aaron's fault. We're suffering, and it's because of them. And I wonder how Moses and Aaron felt at that moment. They had risked everything to get the people out of Egypt. And now the people are pointing fingers at them, even going so far as to say that they wish they had died in Egypt, or that they were still enslaved. That is pretty harsh to hear from the people you gave everything to protect. But before Moses and Aaron can even say anything in response to these complaints, God hears them and speaks to Moses. God tells him that bread will fall down like rain for the Israelites every morning, and that quail will come up in the evening. And I'm sure the people were greatly pleased when God's promise came true and their camp was covered in quail that very night. And I can imagine them going to sleep whispering excitedly about what kind of bread they're going to wake up to in the morning. And then the next morning as the sun rises, I'm sure that they're rushing outside, excited to see this bread that God has delivered for them. But instead they're confused because what they find is a thin, flaky substance on the ground. What is it, they ask? Because they don't recognize this bread. It's unlike anything they've ever eaten before. And if we're being honest, I think we probably would be just as confused as they were by this bread. Our best guess is its description that's in the text, right? It's like frost on the ground. It's thin, flaky, and white. It almost sounds like maybe thin, super thin saltine crackers, right? There's one Hebrew word used here, and only here, which probably means something like peeling, crackling, or being scaly, right? That flaky texture. Not exactly appetizing words when thinking of bread, right? But interestingly, we call it manna because that's what the Israelites said when they saw it. Manna, which means what is it in Hebrew. But even if this miraculous bread is confusing to them, its appearance on the ground in the morning once again shows them that they can put their faith in God, that they can trust that God will provide for them, in this case, one day at a time. But despite this provision, the Israelites continue to struggle with placing their trust in God. It's sort of the story of their lives. It's kind of the story of our lives. But the Israelites, they will wander in the desert for 40 years before entering the promised land. Many of their people, including Moses, will not make it there with them. Much like those other hikers on the trek to Alberta Falls, all they could think about was getting to the promised land, getting to their destination. The journey was just merely an obstacle in their way, preventing them from getting to their desired outcome. Before leaving Egypt, the Israelites had one thing in mind, that land flowing with milk and honey. That destination was all they could focus on. So when the journey to get there kept going on and on and on, they started to doubt why they had even started on that journey in the first place. Would they ever get there? Should they have just stayed in Egypt? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? Was the end result even worth the effort? When Mac and I were hiking to Alberta Falls, we knew what the end goal was. We wanted to see the falls. That was our destination. That was our goal. But our journey wasn't just about completing that task. Our journey, our adventure was also something that we got to enjoy. something to make enjoyable, right? We got to spend uninterrupted time together. We got to immerse ourselves in nature. We got to take pictures and explore off the beaten path. And when we did finally reach our destination, we took time to enjoy it. We spent a long time at Alberta Falls listening to the water and watching all of the people. We were able to rest, drink water, eat a snack, and then eventually, when we were ready, we began the trip back down. And the return journey was even something amazing on its own. We found this little cascade tucked behind a row of trees with crystal clear water that ended up being one of my favorite things I saw the entire trip. And I would have completely missed it had we not allowed ourselves to enjoy the journey and step off the trail for a moment. But in defense of the Israelites, wandering for 40 years throughout the desert wilderness is very different and much more intense than a 1.6 mile hike to and from Alberta Falls, right? I didn't know that there was much scenery to enjoy out in the desert, right? It probably wasn't as beautiful to step off the beaten path in the wilderness that the Israelites were wandering. But that's the truth on many of life's journeys, right? Some stretches of our journeys can be really arduous, difficult, scary. There are moments where the journey is painful, exhausting, or simply just not what you expected. Sometimes, maybe even we get to the end of one journey and we unfortunately discover that the destination was, in fact, not worth the effort. But there's always another new journey, a new opportunity for us to try. And that's the truly great news in this passage. No matter how difficult the journey, no matter how whiny or angry we become, God never deserts us. God delivers us what we need to make it through our journeys. We live in a world where it seems like everyone is focused on reaching the next milestone. This past week was 3 years since Mac proposed to me, and as we were reflecting on our engagement, we both laughed, remembering how quickly people started to ask us about our wedding. It was as if we got engaged and less than an hour later, people wanted to know when the wedding was. And then as soon as we got married, the first question everyone wanted to ask was, when are we going to have a baby? And I'm sure as soon as we do have a child, the next question will be, when's the next baby? It begins to feel like people see your life as a to-do list with items waiting to be checked off. And of course, that puts a lot of pressure on people who aren't reaching those milestones at the typical points that people would expect them to, right? My single friends in their late 20s and 30s feel tremendous pressure to hurry up and get married, even though choosing a life partner is something that should be done thoughtfully. Right? You should absolutely take your time and make sure that you're partnering with the right person. And my friends who struggle with fertility are dealing with enough frustration and sorrow as it is. The last thing they need is for someone to ask them when they're going to have a baby. They would love to know the answer to that question too. And of course, people mean well with those questions, but they can cause a lot more harm than good. When Mac comes home from the Wesley Foundation, I hear lots of stories of college students struggling with similar pressure. College is a unique journey in and of itself, right? Some days are fun, some days are terrible, some days are easy, some days are really, really hard. But the journey is part of the experience. College is about so much more than just getting a degree. It's about learning and growing and discovering yourself, finding what gives you life, building a community. Yet our young people are under more pressure than ever to have it all figured out. So when they don't know what their plan for after college is, when they don't know what they want to do with their life, they can be so consumed with not having those answers that they miss out on the joy of journeying to find the answers, right? When we get so fixated on the destination that we forget to take time to enjoy the journey or simply to process it, it's no wonder why we struggle to trust in God. The manna that God provides us during the journey is oftentimes not delivered in the form of a map with a giant X marking the destination so it's easy to find, right? As much as we wish it were that simple, it's just not. God's manna is often more like baby steps along the way, what you need in one particular day, in one particular moment, just like the Israelites only gathered what they needed for that day. And God's providence shows up the way God wants it to, not the way we want it to. When the Israelites first saw the manna, they had no idea it was the bread they were supposed to eat, right? Because when God said, I'm going to make bread rain from the sky, you're not picturing a really flaky, white, pale substance that looks like snow. And just like that, manna today can take on unexpected forms. Sometimes it is in the form of food, right? Like a free meal when your bank account is dwindling, or a divinely timed casserole from a church friend when you're experiencing a loss. But it's also all of the little things we experience along the way. But ultimately, my friends, God's providence is also something that requires our participation. The Israelites weren't just giving everything they needed up front. They were tasked with collecting the manna each day. They had to go out and get it. God required their participation. In the same way, we have to go out and find our manna. We have to recognize it, acknowledge it for what it is, and we have to be willing to go and collect it for ourselves and also for those who can't go out and collect it. Because there were undoubtedly Israelites among this group who were too young or too old or too sick to go out and help gather the manna every morning. But did God let them starve? No. Because the responsibility became for the people who could go and gather the manna to share it, right? That was the responsibility God tasked them with. And I'm sure that was difficult, right? In the midst of starvation, can you imagine being asked to share precious food with someone, especially someone who you don't even really know? But that's what being part of a community, a family, is all about. We have to care for one another, and we have to trust that in God there's enough for all of us. The destination matters. It does. Losing sight of your goal can cause you to wander into dangerous territory. Mac and I knew not to wander too far off of the beaten path, because that could have been really bad. But we still let ourselves find some time to experience joy and to appreciate our journey. My friends, life doesn't always go the way we plan it to. I don't need to tell you that. You all know that in your own specific ways. But life in its entirety is a gift. The good and the bad, the exciting and the mundane, the happy and the sad. To be alive is to experience all of it, sometimes all at once. And faith is about trusting in God, not just when you've reached that glorious destination, but at every point along the way. And God has never given us a reason not to trust in God. When we grumble and complain, when we lose sight of God's calling for us, when we fall short, God is still showing up for us. God still provides for us. That doesn't mean that we can just kick back and relax and wait for God to drop provisions in our laps. Mac and I didn't get to Alberta Falls by getting off the beaten path and staying there, right? We had to get there by hiking, by walking. But life isn't about finding easy answers to minuscule problems. Life is about living and growing with every twist and every turn, every steep incline and every treacherous decline. Life as children of God is doing exactly that, while also knowing that God journeys alongside us every step of the way. So my friends, do not be discouraged when the journey drags on, because sometimes it will. But instead, turn to God in prayer, trusting that God will always show up for you. And when you receive God's provision, when you receive that manna from heaven, take it and share it with others stuck along the way, so that they can have the strength to keep going too. Amen.